for this interactive fireside chat, we are going to be joined by Jennifer Wipf. She is Ginkgo Bioworks Chief Commercial Officer, and Marcus Schindler, Executive VP and Chief Scientific Officer at Novo Nordisk.
Thanks, Marcus, for joining me today. It's great to talk to you.
Thanks for having me.
We're going to talk a little bit about R&D productivity and the goal of sort of achieving growth and innovation. So maybe I'll start with a provocative question, if you will. Late last year, Wall Street Journal published an article about a trillion-dollar pharma company. Certainly, Novo Nordisk and Lilly are on the watch list to be maybe the first. What's your take on that? Why are there no trillion-dollar pharma companies, and is that something we should be pursuing?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. And I don't have a complete list of trillion-dollar companies out there, but if I recall, it's largely around computers, telephones, and online shopping, and oil, I think, as well, and not health, which I think is an interesting reflection to start with. And by the way, we did some headline news in Europe or in Denmark when we actually overtook a luxury consumer goods brand as Europe's most valuable company, which was a great day because, you know, health was more important than handbags, which I always think maybe is something for us to think about, where actually capital goes. But the point is also, you know, market cap is obviously how the company does financially and how they perform, but also expectations. And I think that's an interesting one. And the real question to me, usually as a scientist, is, or the one I enjoy, is how many millions of patients are we actually serving with our products, with our therapies? And currently that number is somewhere around, for Novo Nordisk, 45 million, which is amazing. Yeah, but that leaves, if we just talk about obesity alone, 950 million, roughly, people without any treatment. Right? And then you can, of course, start extrapolating that is a tremendous opportunity also. And you know, we've, I think, taken an unmet medical need to a treatable condition to a market. And then, you know, everybody can have a fantasy how big that market one day might be.
So if growth for you is not sort of market cap, it's more about addressing health and providing new medicines, why then is the perception of pharma at an all-time low? If health and medicine is so important, so critical, what's your view on society's perception of pharma and what needs to change?
Yeah, and I think we see the polls, we see the results of what the general public usually thinks about pharma. And if I'm honest, I would have thought that post the pandemic, we would, you know, fare better, and I think we did for a time, but again, I mean, that has disappeared. And that is interesting because at the end of the day, we would like to be part of a solution, i.e. living a better life, living a healthier life, but clearly now we're seen as part of the problem. Yeah? And it probably doesn't help that politicians also use it for various purposes and, you know, declare a victory against pharma on some things. I don't think that is particularly helpful. Because fundamentally, and this is why I do this job and why I'm here, you know, I go to work because, you know, we change people's lives. And I would argue that probably some of us wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for the pharmaceutical company, the biotech company, and of course the academic work that has been ongoing. You know, in the pandemic, we managed to get from the discovery of a target to a vaccine in less than a year, and then it was rolled out in billions of doses. Actually, in quite interesting ways also how those manufacturers then contracted with governments without middlemen, without people who also made money out of this process. And I find that really intriguing also to think about what could we truly learn from this as a pharmaceutical organization to go forward.
So in trying to treat more patients and provide novel medicines, you're continually thinking about what kinds of R&D challenges you have. I'm curious to hear a little bit more about how you foster innovation, what kinds of steps you're taking to build that within your own teams, but maybe leverage external partnerships as well and external innovation.
First of all, we are in a complex and difficult business. I think sometimes people come to me and say, oh, you know, this is also complex we're working on, can we not simplify it? And I think there's a confusion between complexity and complication. There's inherent complexity in the systems we're working with. And I actually think that is a good thing. because it needs educated people, really important technologies to solve some of those problems. And it was also great to see, Jason, mentioned Jensen Huang from NVIDIA, that now the tech companies actually would like to deploy, what they can do to our field of research, rather than doing, and no disrespect to gaming or self-driving cars, but maybe understanding biological systems and better medicines are also good use of CPUs. Yeah, so I think that is really good. Where I think we are different in a way, and I know it's not a very common thing in the US in particular, is that we are owned by a foundation. And actually our founders set up this foundation because they felt the proceeds of the money that we make should actually go to a large degree back to society, which I think is actually really, really interesting setup. What it gives us is also a long-term view on things, that we're trying to work on big chronic diseases in particular that, frankly, also in obesity, many others have not worked on for the last 2 decades, and now everybody is waking up to this opportunity. And it brings with it, I think, persistence, a level of focus, but also really the understanding that solving those complex problems takes time. Right? There's an iterative process, and maybe we'll talk about this, but this is not something you can fix overnight. And a bit provocative, I don't think the investment community, in particular in environments like here, has, over the last years maybe understood that and bought into that value proposition, that it is worthwhile also investing in some of those big diseases. Yeah.
The ability to have that patience to pursue something that's very long-term, I think is quite unique. How does that change sort of the decisions that you make in the R&D process? How does that change the teams that you build and sort of the solutions that you're trying to drive among your team?
It is actually fundamentally important, and there's obviously a dark side to long-term outlook and foundation ownership. Sometimes, you might run the risk that there isn't so much of a sense of urgency, right? Because, well, there's always tomorrow and we can solve it later, right? So it's finding that right balance, and also instilling that, our patients have no time to waste out there if they don't get the medicines. In particular now where we talk about the challenges of scalability of some of the medicines that we're making, that is very imminent. This is not in a decade or so from now. So I think it's finding that balance, but it does allow us to do things, I would say, properly, and not find quick fixes, and also get to the bottom of understanding the diseases we're working on, but also putting ourselves out some big hairy goals that we would like to achieve. What if we could treat hundreds of millions of patients out there? What if we could get to curative approaches, right? And that is a privilege to be in such a position that we can think about these problems.
I might be remiss to not mention the collaboration, our collaboration that we announced the expansion of yesterday. How do you think about leveraging external innovation, the kind of scalability that companies like Ginkgo and others that you work with provide in leveraging that kind of growth? And
we're a company actually that comes from Denmark and had traditionally the vast majority of their workforce, their innovation internally, so through organic growth, which by the way also helps now with hindsight to define productivity, because we own every invention that we've made, which means it's all great, even if we were maybe on the face of it the most unproductive company ever, which we probably aren't, but maybe we're not as productive, right? And this is where you guys come in, is that we cannot assume this will continue forever, right? So first of all, are we going into spaces that are really unknown, where no one knows, is that the right biology we're going after? Are those diseases we should be tackling? The world is bigger, and we have a room full of smart people with amazing ideas here, what I've just seen earlier today. So for me, there's a bit of a no-brainer that we should get together on those things. And then there are some near-term challenges, right, where the complexities and the opportunities are so big that it just calls for collaboration. And what I've been inspired by when I first met you is this real industrial scaling applied to biological or chemical problems, right? And I think we saw that quote also earlier on, this engineering mindset in science, and that actually is intriguing. And I think you're putting this into practice, and that's, I feel, where we're quite energized by, and also to see, how can we get to some of those, solutions for big problems.
Pinging on that thread, a little continuation, I think we have a collection of people here today from wide-ranging industries, right? We heard from folks in agriculture and all across the board. Are there challenges that you see that are exclusive to the pharmaceutical industry, or what shared challenges do you think exist across those industries, and any solutions that we should think about globally?
So obviously, coming from R&D, I would think there is a fundamental proposition here that when we go out to discover or to do research, we venture into the unknown. We go to places where nobody has been, and that's the fun part. But certainly for some of my colleagues working in finance, that is also the scary part. So I hope anyone who works in any form of R&D setting shares that passion to find novel things, but not just because they're novel, but because they could help, they could make a difference. And that's why I work in pharma, not in academia, because it's science with a purpose. Right? And we can think of a product, we can think how some of the solutions, even we saw today, might actually change the world. So I think that is common between all of us, but it's also really difficult and sometimes to articulate what is the project and when is it coming to the market, right? It's challenging to extrapolate this. So the finance model, be it through an external community, but also internally, is challenging. So how can we actually build trust? How can we build stepwise approaches of de-risking our business, right? Where we show we're moving forward and give confidence. And that is one thing, and I don't know whether it's specific to pharma, but it's very deep that our cycle times are incredibly long. So the learnings that we can get, are years out, and sometimes it's way too late to react to them. So I'm actually really intrigued also by maybe hearing from some of you how we should think about prototyping and truly agile ways of working where we have minimal viable product, and start to think about this in medicine is maybe not simple, but how could we do this to actually get to fast learning cycles and moving on much quicker. The other piece, if I may, is shared platforms. Right, so as a German, I like cars, high quality cars, but they're sharing some platforms, right? There are some fundamental principles that everybody's using, and then everybody puts their brand sticker on it. We're not doing that in pharma, right? We're starting with right from scratch, and then we need to own it. And defining pre-competitive space is still very, very hard for us. I don't think that is very sustainable. Yeah, and we spoke about data today, right? I mean, who on earth can we think that we will own data, really? Yeah, but we might own the analytics or, the prompting, whatever have you.
It's very interesting to think about sort of the tools and technologies that are coming to bear with AI, and we were chatting about this earlier, this sort of model in pharma that's unique around the ownership of data. How do you see that changing over time, and should it?
I'm really intrigued by this thought now with machine learning, moving into our space. The machine will make molecules. Those molecules might one day be the best molecules, well, probably not even we can think of, because we clearly didn't think of those molecules. The machine did. So what is then the inventive step? What is then actually IP, right? And how will this be defined? And if you really take that further, then you can think we have a rather unique model in pharma, and maybe also that comes back a little bit to the perception that we have a protectionist area here where we have decades of patent protection. Nobody can work in this space. What if we were to think about products, product concepts, and improvement of our products, aka medicines? Yeah, so we have medicine, version 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth, rather than clinging on to this patent protection to fund research that, with the best intent, is not very efficient right now. Yeah, and I have no solution for this, but I find this a really interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, it's very interesting that other industries have had those common platforms and yet been able to create successful businesses around those, right? There's space for Uber and Lyft and many other ride shares that are basically the same platform.
Yeah.
a very different model than pharma today.
And I don't think we've really spent time to think about, as a pharma industry, how true disruption to our business could look like. And I think that's a dangerous position, by the way, because if we don't think about it, somebody else might. Yeah, and before you know it, you have an executive order and things happen that you clearly aren't prepared for. Yeah.
Let's see what has come up from the audience. So this is an interesting one. Someone is a maybe ESG follower here. Novo Nordisk has been working on striving for zero environmental impact by 2045. How does that goal impact your decision making? Does it spark fear or sort of smaller thinking or creativity or a mix? How does that work?
Yeah, the first question we should always ask, why 2045, right? And why not earlier? So okay, we said 2045 and interim 2030 and so forth. The important thing here, and this is I think is really important, that this is not just Novo Nordisk as it is today, but actually our entire ecosystem. So you might feel that as well, right? Or any supplier who works with us actually needs to be in this, because I think this is really important in everything that we do, be it on carbon emissions, be it on the usage of animals. It doesn't stop with us and our walls. It actually is everybody who works with us. And it has impact on our decisions actually on a daily basis. So environmental responsibility and societal impact are criteria that we're actually using even at the start of a drug discovery project. We obviously also look into the commercial opportunity, we look into whether we can develop it, what is the technology, but can we make it? Can we make it in a sustainable way? Can we actually bring it to the patients that need us? They are core decisions we're taking at that juncture very, very early on. And I actually think that is important, that it brings us to a sort of full payment model, right? Often we try to make molecules fast and also cheap, but the cheap is short-lived often, because we might use chemicals that aren't particularly healthy, we might use processes that we can't scale. So to put this at the front and think, are we making the molecule in the right way so we don't have to fix problems later on? Right? I mean, if the molecule is only in the body for a day, then yeah, you have to give an injection or swallow a pill every day. That's not very sustainable. What if we find a molecule that can last a month or a year? Yeah, wouldn't that be cool? We don't need plastic pens for that.
Someone says we love Novo Nordisk. That's a great question. How about, I like this one. Marcus, what has been your biggest failure and what did you learn from it?
I usually tell my organization we don't fail, we learn. Yeah, but seriously, it is an important mindset. Of course, I've made decisions where at some point in time, other data were coming out and I felt, okay, if I'd known this at this point in time, I would have done something different, or I didn't recognize it. I backed a few programs and I let go of some other programs where I felt, yeah, maybe with hindsight, that wasn't so smart. But honestly, that is a gift of hindsight, right? And it's so easy to live your life with hindsight, right? For me, it's always, do you make a decision at this juncture? Do you have the data at hand? And do you give good attention to the data? Do you allow a diversity of thought, opinion, right? So I don't decide, well, I eventually decide many things, but through wise counsel with many people. And being able to listen and take also extreme positions, I think is really important. Now, a failure would be for me if I don't listen, right? If I close my mind and I say, whatever, I have this preconceived notion, and this is what it's going to be. Of course, I've made some personal failures along the way, but I have to admit, in a work context in drug discovery, I actually don't look back with regret. It's the past. What have I learned from it that actually makes me better going forward?
There are a number of questions that are sort of all around the same theme, really around sort of Novo Nordisk's focus to date on diabetes and obesity. And the questions are there other therapeutic areas that you all are particularly interested in, and or are there new modalities that you're particularly excited about?
Yeah, so for the last couple of years, we've also recognized, that diabetes in isolation, yes, it is a disease and it requires, important medicine. But linked to diabetes are obviously a lot of comorbidities: renal disease, cardiovascular disease. Linked to obesity are dyslipidemia, osteoarthritis, joint problems. Right? So we've actually opened up also the science to say we're a bit more disease agnostic, and we actually work on systems, because our body doesn't really care about the departments that we put up to say, I work in diabetes research and I work in heart research. Yeah, guys, they're kind of interlinked. Yeah, they don't work in isolation, and that was a bit of a culture change, I have to say. So we are much broader in this cardiometabolic space, and at the end of the day, if you look at the results of our diabetes and obesity medicines, we're running cardiovascular outcome trials. So at the end of the day, what matters is, do we live longer? And I would also argue better, with those medicines. But we also do, because, and maybe these days, this is a little bit ignored, we actually have a sizable group working on rare diseases. Novo Nordisk for a number of decades has worked on hemophilia in particular, and factor VIII. We're working with 270 here in town on a potential gene editing approach. We're working on sickle cell diseases. And why do we do this? Because we like to entertain two different business models. One is general practitioner, big diseases, many patients, but also specialty care, close to the patient, shorter timelines from research to development to the market. And that's actually a really interesting, sometimes tension even, but I think a good model we're running.
And any new modalities that you're really excited about?
Yeah, and that's the problem with me. I'm easily excited. Give me
All
something new, and I'm like, oh, go, cool, yeah, wow. Okay, why are we not doing this? So, but at the end of the day, modalities this is our tools, right? The modalities in themselves, they are useless if you don't know how to imply them. It's a little bit like AI. We can do a lot of number crunching. If you don't ask the question, right, then you won't understand the answer. But yes, we are obviously known for peptide and protein therapeutics. We made an acquisition here in town on Dicerna, on siRNA, because this modality has some interesting features. High precision, right, to the gene of interest, and then usually a long-term knockdown of the gene. And I actually think that actually brings us much closer to infrequent dosing and reducing the burden of treatment on patients and improving compliance. Because if you take a medicine, once every half year or every year, you simply don't have to worry about it. Yeah. But we also have an interesting group working on cell therapies, which gives us an opportunity to replace what is no longer there in the human body, beta cells, or for example, dopaminergic neurons, where we have a trial running in Parkinson's disease, a trial running in heart failure. And I think those are all really interesting modalities to inquire on and learn. They're not mature yet, I would say, but worth exploring. Yeah. And I've probably forgotten 1,000 modalities that I'm interested in.
Shall we list them all?
Yeah.
There's several questions here that I'll try to consolidate. We've spoken a lot about AI and machine learning. So what is your overall outlook? Is this hype, or do you have hope?
Phew.
I like that.
That's probably not for me to say, but I would say generically, in when you see movements like this, yes, there will be some hype and there will be some overpromise. I think we are doing a lot of due diligences also on potential partners, and we're also finding out that, there's real stuff, and we can see that, and there also isn't. Yeah, and there's a lot of imagination that is not really anchored in reality. But what we already see, we have the first use cases. We worked actually in a collaboration with Microsoft, real impact on productivity and some processes. But honestly, I think that is the boring part, if I may say so. This will be done, and we don't even think about it anymore at some point in time. And the real interesting things are the ones that go beyond human cognition. Yeah, and I think some of our biological systems that we're dealing with are just too complex for us to understand what really happens in real time in a cell, let alone in an organ or in a body. And if we put computing power to this, I think this could potentially be amazing. And then of course, all the data we'll generate through our wearable friends, what if we could get into disease prediction, what if we could identify, hey, you're on a difficult course here, you know, your lifestyle, your postcode, your upbringing, your genetics together put you on a really, really bad trajectory. There's something, you know, for you to do. And we actually put what we call a transformational prevention unit at work. And maybe you think it's crazy because we're not even treating many people with obesity, but we're already thinking now about how we could prevent it.
And maybe as a last question, let's wrap up with your sort of closing thoughts. In the broad field of engineering biology, what do you think the next 10, 20 years will bring?
Yeah,
Give us your predictions.
Yeah, these are the difficult questions. And coming back maybe a little bit what I also said at the beginning, I mean, with all the advances we've made in medicines, I think we're just, you know, really scratching the surface. For some of the therapies that we're using. When we simply talk about obesity, people ask me, so how much more efficacy do we want to see in obesity? And my answer is usually, you know, to the point where, you know, people can live a healthy life. And whatever you define as normal weight, that doesn't matter, but where you live a reasonably healthy life. How can we actually roll it out to hundreds of millions of people who might benefit from this? So there's a piece around, you know, moving on that. I was really, as a scientist, inspired about COVID vaccination, and in the UK, the National Health Service actually thinks about a one-shot strategy. So what if we had this thought, you go once a year to your physician and administer a compound of drugs against cardiovascular disease, against diabetes, and so forth. What are the features of the molecules? What are the technologies we should be using to do this? And then really turn it into true healthcare, because it's sick care right now, right? We're treating when it's late. What if we could actually move the needle to go in early and bring us into a better place? I know these are very big ticket items, but hopefully we can make an impact there.
We may have some folks who want to talk about some of those big ideas coming up soon. Thank you so much, Marcus, for joining us today. And a special thanks to the audience for all of your questions. They were very, very good.
Thank you.
Thank you.